Okay, you have been introduced to the principle of beneficence, which requires us to protect people from harm or injury, to relieve their injuries or their sufferings if they have already experienced harm, and to act in ways that promotes their welfare. We have seen that this is grounded in our social nature, in the reality of our mutual dependence upon one another, not just for survival, but for happiness, for welfare, for flourishing. Despite that solid and significant grounding for this idea that we should act in the interests of others, we have considered Kant's claim that the principle of beneficence is imperfect, which is to say it is weaker than other principles, particularly the principle of non-maleficence, and that we have a great deal of discretion in deciding when actually we should act in the interests of others. In this presentation, we want to think about an argument that says there are, in fact, situations in which we are perfectly obligated to act on behalf of others. That is to say, as wrong not to act as we would be if we actually harmed, injured, or killed another. The ideas I'm presenting to you here are from a book called Principles of Biomedical Ethics by two contemporary moral philosophers, Tom Beauchamp and Jim Childress. Jim Childress is the person under whom I did my PhD at the University of Virginia. They make a powerful argument to say that there are, in fact, situations in which our obligation to come to the aid of another is perfect, is as strong as our obligation not to hurt them. Let's consider the criteria they offer for discerning when that's the case. First, they say, we are obligated to intervene to help another when the other is at a risk of significant loss or damage. So think about this. They are talking about a situation in which we are called to act to prevent harm to another. If that harm or risk is significant, we may well be obligated to act. So what do they have in mind? If the person is at a high risk of being severely injured or dying, and we can prevent it, then we surely might have a perfect obligation to act. Second, they say, if it's a situation in which our action is in fact needed to prevent the loss. Now what they have in mind here is a situation where, let's say, the action of someone else might prevent the loss. Well, if someone else's action might prevent the loss, then I might not be obligated to act. Or if there are hundreds of things that could happen to keep the person from experiencing this injury or this loss or this death, then I may not be obligated to act. But if my action is absolutely necessary, then in fact they would suggest we're getting toward a situation in which my obligation to help is perfect. Third, they would say, my obligation approaches perfection if, in fact, my action would probably prevent the loss. So it's not simply that it's necessary. So if I don't act, they will die. But if I do act, they probably won't. That my intervention will, in fact, probably or is highly likely to prevent the loss. Fourth, they say, we are probably perfectly obligated to act if the other is at a risk of significant loss. Our action is necessary. Our action would probably work, and it involves only minimal risks to myself. And then finally, if there are some risks to myself, but the benefit to the other outweighs that, then clearly the benefit is disproportionate to the potential harm to me. In that kind of a situation, they would argue the obligation to help is perfect. Consider a child who has been pushed into a pool of water, a child that cannot swim. Now, clearly the person that pushed them into the pool of water violated the principle of non-maleficence. Now let's think about your or my obligation to intervene to save the child. And the question we're asking is my obligation to save the child as great as the obligation of the other person not to have hurt them in the first place was? Well, let's think about this. Is the child at a risk of significant loss or damage? Yes, assuming that the child cannot swim, he faces a high risk of dying. Is our action necessary to prevent the loss? Well, let's imagine I'm the only person around, or you're the only person around. If you don't act, the child dies. Will your action be likely to prevent the loss? Well, that may well depend on whether you can swim, or I can swim, whether we have life-saving training, such that we're pretty darn sure that if we jump in the pool, we will be able to save the child. And this relates to the next point. How much risk will this put to myself? If the only risk is that I'm not in a bathing suit, I'll ruin the clothes I'm in. If that's the only risk, then they would say, surely you're obligated to help. If I can swim and I have life-saving, I'm not really putting my own life at risk. So clearly, the risk to me is far outweighed by the potential benefit to the child. So they would say in a situation like that, Kant is wrong. That is to say, in a situation like that, the obligation to help, the obligation to which beneficence points, is surely as weighty as the obligation not to help. If the child dies in this situation, the point would be, we who did not help and could have easily are as morally responsible and morally culpable as the person who pushed the child into the pond in the first place.